Good afternoon, everybody. I'm University President Mark Schlissel, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for the Distinguished University Professorship Series. I'm happy to be here as we celebrate faculty excellence at the University of Michigan. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the deans or department chairs that may be joining us today for their contributions to recruiting and retaining and promoting the careers of such outstanding faculty. I'd also like to acknowledge the faculty, staff, and students who are in attendance and thank them for their many contributions to excellence at the University of Michigan. I want to give a special shout out to our colleagues at the Horace H. Rackham School of Graduate Studies, which selects our DUPs each year. In 1947, our Board of Regents established the Distinguished University Professorships, creating U of M's most prestigious professorships. Faculty selected for this recognition named the professorship after a person of distinction in their relevant field in consultation with the dean of the school or college in which they hold an appointment. The duration of the appointment is unlimited, and the title may be retained after retirement. The DUPs recognize senior faculty with exceptional scholarly or creative achievements, national and international reputations for academic excellence, and superior records of teaching, mentoring, and service. One of our greatest strengths as a university is the far-reaching excellence of our faculty. They're not only brilliant researchers, they're also talented educators and engaged scholars. They give our students the opportunity to learn from teachers and mentors who are working at the very frontiers of their fields. And as they expand the boundaries of their disciplines and of human knowledge and understanding, they also expand the horizons of our students' minds. The Michigan faculty are central to the outstanding impact of education and discovery at U of M that resounds through the generations. They define the questions that will be asked in the pursuit of truth while fostering our students' lifelong capacity for inquiry and discovery. Today, we'll hear from three distinguished university professors emeriti, each of whom has unquestionably left a legacy in their fields and on our campus. Each will give a brief lecture, and then we'll take a few questions. Rackham Dean Michael Solomon will be our Q&A moderator. Joining us for the introduction of our first distinguished colleague this afternoon is Provost Susan Collins. The academic excellence of the University of Michigan has remained strong throughout the global pandemic, and I thank Provost Collins for outstanding leadership of the University of Michigan academic community. Her tremendous efforts have made it possible for U of M to continue looking forward and delivering in our mission of education, research, and service. Thank you, Provost Collins, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate and am delighted to be here. And it is such a special honor to introduce fellow economist and Ford School colleague, Paul Courant. Since arriving in Ann Arbor as Assistant Professor of Economics and Public Policy, Paul has become an exemplar of the university's and higher education's commitment to research, teaching, and service. The title of Paul's undergraduate course, Systematic Thinking About the Problems of the Day, is also a good descriptor of his career. With an undergraduate degree in history and graduate degrees in economics, Paul brings a historian's broad curiosity about how societies work or don't, and an economist's orientation towards problem definition and solution to his work. This combination provides a strong foundation for addressing societal concerns, something that Paul does extraordinarily well. His array of interests has led to the careful examination of issues, including poverty and inequality, of states, information storage and retrieval, tax policy, education, radon detection, and much more. From the effects of the earned income tax credit on people's well-being to the development of new principles that support access to information in the digital age, Paul has brought intellectual leadership to a commitment to equity and inclusion in matters of public concern. Paul is an acclaimed teacher and highly regarded mentor. His skill in recognizing talent in others and his thoughtful support of their learning has helped generations of students develop habits of mind that serve them well throughout their lives. Broad interest and a penchant for problem solving characterize Paul's service as well. His work on the digitization of academic libraries has democratized scholarship in meaningful ways. Paul has lent his expertise to projects focused on the economic and fiscal structure of the state, providing the foundation for effective policies. He is also the architect of the University of Michigan's budget model, which gives primacy to academic concerns, ensuring that our mission drives budgetary decisions, not the other way around. And so, with deep appreciation for his many contributions to the public good and the common good, the university proudly names Paul Courant the Edward M. Gramlich Distinguished University Professor of Economics and Public Policy. And so it is a great pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to him. Paul?
Thank you, Susan. And I note that you said that I was good at identifying talent where it was there. I note that I spent quite a bit of effort, more than once, trying to hire you before we succeeded. And I was right about that. That was a very good choice. In Kurt Vonnegut's novel, The Sirens of Titan, one of the characters is called upon to explain how he came to be where he is. He answers that he was a victim of a series of accidents, as are we all. As I try to account for being given the extraordinary honor of appointment as the Edward M. Gramlich Distinguished University Professor, I find myself looking back on a series of accidents, most of them happy. The first is the accident of birth. My father taught me to think and instilled in me the belief that the world and the universe and their many parts could be understood, or at least could be better understood, and that the whys and hows of what puzzles us are available for comprehension with the help of logic, observation and measurement, and joy in trying to make sense of things. I had the wonderful good fortune to grow up at a dinner table that was filled with questions and puzzles and answers. History, politics, science, philosophy, pretty much everything were all subjects of inquiry and discussion. While my physicist father was teaching me that questions had answers, and I realized that can be disputed in some quarters, but not in his head, that questions had answers, and that looking for questions and answers was a great way to have a good time, my mother was teaching me, to quote Ringo Starr, that you could learn a lot from a book. I learned that if I had a book handy, I couldn't be bored. And in my mother's house, any place with a book in front of one's face was a safe space. From the beginning of my professional career, I've had the good fortune to have terrific colleagues and collaborators with wide expertise that I could draw on. I view my career and its successes largely as the product of others' work and their engagement with mine. Can I have the slide, please? At the top of the list is Ned Gramlich, for whom my chair is named. Ned's academic work is both broad and deep. He worked on the war on poverty in its early days, studied minimum wages and their effects, more or less invented subnational stabilization policy, developed the basic framework that economists use to study intergovernmental economic activity, wrote the first book on subprime mortgages, and more. In today's New York Times, by the way, Paul Krugman writes a couple of lines about Ned and Ned's understanding of subprime mortgages way before other people did. He belongs in any who's who of policy economists, and his work covers what's what of important economic policy problems. He was also an accomplished administrator, serving in leadership positions in the Ford School, the Econ Department, the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, and many others. His career and the relentless good humor with which it was undertaken have been an inspiration to me and to many others. Since his passing, my work isn't as good as it used to be, and I miss him. Here's the next accident. My career started with an extraordinary piece of good luck. I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore in an honors program that involved exams that were taken at the end of the senior year and were given by external examiners. There were 8 exams, 4 in the major, history in my case, 2 in each of 2 minors, political science and economics. Following the written exam, the examiners visited campus and conducted oral exams. Although I liked history, I wasn't much good at it. And the honors examiner in economics, Joe Peckman of the Brookings Institution, liked my economics exams and liked me. And a few weeks after, he offered me a job at Brookings, first as an RA for Joseph Kershaw on a book about the war on poverty, and then as a research assistant to Herbert Stein, a student and practitioner of economic policy who played many important roles in and out of government. Stein was a moderate Republican, and he taught me many things, including that there were such things as moderate Republicans. When Stein was appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors by President Nixon, he took me along as his research assistant. I discovered that one could develop a career doing economic policy and learning about society through the lens of economics. As a very young, recent college graduate, I was introduced to dozens of skilled and influential policy economists, including Alice Rivlin, who was the first director of the Congressional Budget Office, Arthur Okun, and Henry Aaron, the economist, not the ball player. The council's senior staff, then and now, was drawn from academic institutions, faculty at academic institutions, usually for terms of a year. Bill Branson was a senior staff economist when I worked at the council, and Branson suggested that I should pursue doctoral studies at Princeton, where he was on the faculty. And so I did. I was interested in poverty and discrimination, which were hot topics and which were related to my earlier work with Kershaw, but I wound up studying urban economics, working under Edwin S. Mills. Mills was one of the early developers of the field of urban economics, using mathematics to build formal models of urban residential structure, the physical and demographic shape of cities. Why are some places dense and other places sparse? How do forces for agglomeration interact with the cost of congestion? My dissertation built on Mills's models to look at the effect of prejudice and discrimination in housing markets and the location of blacks and whites in cities. I was in heaven, doing intricate formal modeling to shed light on significant problems in the real world as part of a group of scholars that was developing a new field. 3 years later, I finished my PhD at Princeton and was offered a job at Michigan, which I took. Once again, I hit the jackpot. The University of Michigan was one of a handful of institutions that received grants from the Ford Foundation to establish interdisciplinary research and teaching centers in public policy grounded in the social sciences. The UM version was called the Institute of Public Policy Studies, or IPS, and the early IPS faculty was extraordinary, including Pat Creasine, the founding director, Sid Winter, Bob Putnam, Jack Walker, Joel Aberbach, John Chamberlain, Michael Cohen, Larry Moore, and Dan Rubenfeld. A couple of years later, we hired Ned Gramlich, and during my first years at IPS, the faculty got bigger and better, including Bob Axelrod, Bob Stern, Edie Goldenberg, Mary Corcoran, Janet Weiss, Alan Deardorff, and Carl Simon. We talked amongst each other all the time. We had weekly interdisciplinary seminars and were consistently engaged by each other's work and this developing field of public policy. My idea of a good time was to bring fairly high-tech social science to bear on real-world problems in economic and social policy. This was pretty much exactly the founding idea behind IPS. Another happy accident. I also got to work on a lot of different interesting problems. The next few slides present an incomplete list of topics and co-authors. Could I have the next slide, please? It's Ned Gramlich, Dan Rubenfeld, and I were interested in state and local governments and in fiscal federalism, which is constituted by the interactions in taxing and spending across levels of government. This field was wide open, following Ned's earlier work on the economics of intergovernmental grants. The theory of intergovernmental grants strongly predicts that a lump sum grant from one government to another should have the same effect on the receiving jurisdiction as an increase in private income of the same amount. But it doesn't. Rather, there is a flypaper effect, a term coined by Arthur Okun and first published, I think, by us, in which money sticks where it hits, hence the flypaper idea. Economists are enormously creative about this sort of naming of things. A grant to a local government of a given amount will generally increase public spending by much more than would an increase in income of the same amount. Ned, Dan, and I proposed an explanation based on systematic misinterpretation of the change in municipal budgets and relative prices of governmental and private goods. This is illustrated in the next slide, which I'm not going to explain. In the next few years, we produced, in various combinations, a number of papers about state and local public finance in cities, covering topics including tax limitation, which is still an issue in California, political behavior of public employees, the incidence of the property tax, the size of government, and the mechanisms that produce segregation and discrimination in housing markets. In 1979, I was invited to serve as a senior staff economist at the Council of Economic Advisors for the coming academic year. The council staff is small, so its members get to work across many fields and many problems. The policy problems came quickly, and I came to realize that I liked the pace and the variety of topics. Although I didn't know it at the time, I was on the path that would eventually lead me to the provost's office some years later, applying economics to administrative problems. Can I have the next slide? It's just a list of more things and more people that I was up to at the time. When I say that lots of other people wrote my CV, you get the flavor of it there. At the CEA, I worked on national health insurance. 40 years ago, we were working on national health insurance. Progress was slow. I worked on designing policies to deal with petroleum shortfalls, much of which is quite relevant to the current discussion of carbon taxes. I worked with colleagues at Treasury and Health and Human Services, finding ways to keep Social Security and Medicare afloat, at least for a while. So far, so good. I spent a lot of time analyzing tax cut proposals, and I developed an interest in taxes and tax policy that has endured ever since. I also enjoyed learning about the determinants of economic growth, and there was a rush associated with seeing my work in the next days or next week's news or presidential proclamation or draft legislation or regulation. There was a moment, there's a moment in an episode of The West Wing where Ainsley Hayes completely rewrites a policy recommendation of Sam Seaborn's, and the revision goes straight to the Oval Office. Hayes is flabbergasted. Her analysis turns into settled policy in the blink of an eye. How can that be? She asks. Seaborn says, "We play with live ammo around here." I confess to liking that feeling. Without knowing it, I had developed a taste for administration. And the next slide, please. Still more of these things. I have to mention one person on this slide, two people. Well, I'm going to mention Sarah Turner because I don't mention her anywhere else in my prepared remarks. And she was my graduate student, and she was terrific. When I returned to Michigan, Mary Corcoran, a political science professor and sometime labor economist whose expertise was in poverty and discrimination, and I began work on a number of projects about gender differences in pay and career paths. With two graduate students, Robert Wood and Mary Noonan, we found, among other things, that women lawyers who took time away from the labor market to care for their children generally suffered permanent penalties in pay for doing so. Mary and I also taught a course together called Inequality in the U.S. John Chamberlain and I wrote a theoretical paper proposing a method for selecting representative committees. The idea of this paper has come around to be important again. How can we design electoral institutions that produce committees whose deliberations will be representative of the range of points of view held in the polity and whose choices will be similar to the choices the polity would make by a majority rule? Alan Deerdorf and I wrote several papers about lumpy countries, by which we meant countries whose economic resources are not homogeneously distributed across the country. This work combined my expertise in urban economics with Alan's expertise in international trade, and also turned out to have implications for environmental economics. My research program was basically opportunistic. Find a colleague who's fun to work with and who wants to study a problem that is technically interesting and that has some policy implications. Exploit the fact that economics can be used as a powerful tool to learn something about almost any policy problem. Lather, rinse, repeat. I used a similar approach in designing an undergraduate introductory course to public policy, the one Susan talked about earlier. Taking policy problems, for example, the Electoral College or the Flint water crisis, and team teaching with faculty who had relevant expertise that complemented the economic approach. The results of this approach were mostly pretty good, but not always. Here's a nice anecdote where it didn't work so well. When the Ford School moved from Lorch Hall to its new quarters in Weil Hall, I went through file drawers hoping that I would have the discipline to throw most of the stuff out. I found several folders full of yellow pads that were full of math. I was a bit puzzled that I had no recollection of producing this work, which was plainly mine. It was in my handwriting. The next day, digging further, I found an envelope with 50 reprints of the stunningly forgettable article that was derived from these yellow pads. The article is called "The Effects of Federal Capital Taxation on Growing and Declining Areas," and if you read it, you'll be one of the first, even though it was written 30 years ago. 2 more accidents, both big. Then Provost Nancy Cantor appointed me as Associate Provost for Academic and Budgetary Affairs in the fall of 1997 and charged me and Marilyn Knepp, a longtime member of the Provost budget staff who has extraordinary skill in fiscal matters, with revising the recently implemented value-centered management budget system that had been promulgated by the previous Provost, Gil Whitaker. There are many ways to design a budgeting system for complicated entities like universities, but 3 types of budget models are most widely used. One of these, which the U of M used until the 1990s, is called incremental budgeting. Basically, this year's budget for most units is equal to last year's budget plus an increment of a few percent. Small adjustments are made in response to changes in mission or costs. This system is predictable and manageable, but it does not provide incentives for units to take steps that would increase revenue or reduce costs, and it doesn't produce any flexible resources, and it doesn't provide any way of engaging in new innovations. Responsibility-centered management, which was the system that Provost Whitaker had, has very strong incentives to cut costs and increase revenue, but relies on a complicated set of formulas that attribute costs and revenues from most of the university to the schools and colleges, and leads to deans and the provost spending a lot of energy, intellectual and otherwise, fighting over the formulas rather than debating the merits. Can I have the next slide, please? Just gives you some good facts about budgeting. The good budgeting system should get things mostly right and then have the opportunity for the leadership to make adjustments to get things almost completely right. The system that Marilyn and I designed kept the incentives for revenue increases and cost reductions because units were allowed to keep most of the benefits of those. There was also a tax, which the deans still love, just ask them, in order to give the provost flexibility to unwind untoward effects of the model and to move resources to other priorities. Next slide, please. Activity-based budgeting models allow both the local leadership and the central administration to see clearly budget opportunities and potential budget threats. It's important to recognize, however, that the purpose of good budget models is not to maximize revenue. The university is a mission-driven nonprofit. The ability of the provost to alter the outcomes that derive from simply running the model is crucial to a successful budgeting system and to good performance on the part of the institution. I'm an economist, I confess. Money is important, but it's not everything. I believe that my greatest accomplishment as an academic administrator was my work first as provost and then as university librarian on the Google Book Project and the subsequent development of the Hathi Trust, which is a worldwide academic digital library with holdings of more than 17 million volumes. In 2002, shortly after I became provost, Bill Gosling, the university librarian, and John Wilkin, the associate librarian for digital collections, showed up in my office. They'd just been in conversation with Larry Page, one of the co-founders and co-leaders of Google. Larry had been visiting campus at the invitation of the College of Engineering and had asked the Dean of Engineering to arrange a meeting with the librarian. The dean, who of course had his eye on potential gifts from Larry, was not entirely pleased, but one doesn't say no to such a request. Larry had made an astonishing request of his own. Would the University of Michigan permit Google to create, at Google's expense, digital copies of all of its library holdings? My immediate answer was yes, yes, yes. There were so many valuable uses of a digitized copy of the library, not the least of which was the possibility that it could provide broad access to library materials worldwide. We were excited to have a backup copy of our library available for preservation and access by users with print disabilities, searchable and usable for computational linguistics and natural language processing. We insisted that the library's copy would be under the library's control, acting in the interests of the university and students and scholars everywhere. As we discussed the details of the project, John Wilkins successfully argued for a clause to the effect that we could share our copy with other consortia made up of other academic and research institutions. This agreement laid the foundation for the HathiTrust, a consortium of libraries far larger and more versatile than even the largest individual libraries. HathiTrust was named, by the way, by me, for the elephant, Hathi, which is strong, long-lived, and never forgets, just like a library. In the course of one day, Larry had changed the world. It wasn't the only time he did that in the course of one day, or at least opened up the world to change. It suddenly became imaginable that the world's library collections, if Michigan could do it, so could many others, could be made, although we were first and we got a hugely valuable support from our administration and regents, could be made available, at least in principle, broadly. This is a utopian vision for librarians. Suddenly we could imagine pretty much everything that ever been published being made available to readers pretty much anywhere in the world. The project didn't realize that utopian vision for copyrighted works, but the utopian vision became plausible. And meanwhile, we could search, compute, preserve, etc. The several million works in the HathiTrust that were not in copyright could be read by pretty much everyone, pretty much any time. Prior to the Google Library project, the library had been scanning about 10,000 volumes per year. The Google project scanned about 30,000 volumes per week, well over 1 million books a year. Much legal wrangling ensued, during which we established that the scans by Google and the university did not violate copyright, giving us permanent control of a rich digital collection covering much of the cultural and scholarly record of the world. In my view, there's a straightforward economic and legal argument to be made for liberalizing the scans, access to the scans even more, but that's for another day. Meanwhile, 17 million volumes are in the HathiTrust under the control of academic libraries. Library utopia is tantalizingly close. Before the Google Book Project, it was merely fantasy. I have to note that one of the side benefits of being involved in the legal wrangling was that I came to know and work with several wonderful lawyers, including Jack Bernard in the General Counsel's office, Jessica Littman in the law school, and Pam Samuelson in the law school at Berkeley. And what I think of as exemplary of the Michigan way of doing things, Jessica and I designed and twice taught a course on technology and the future of publishing. It was the mark of a great university, I think, that a visionary idea about academic infrastructure produces, among other things, a team-taught course. But by the way, let's have the next slide. There's an episode of StoryCorps about Michigan and the Google project with a conversation between me and former President Coleman that you might find of interest. One more accident. I'm currently working on a Mellon-sponsored project to study the effects of liberal arts education. This was Mellon's idea. That's the accident. I don't have time to discuss the project, but once again, it's a difficult and interesting policy problem, and U of M has provided me with terrific colleagues and support and opportunity. Education is the most effective policy we know to improve the quality of life. Understanding how it works has profound policy implications. Being here with wonderful colleagues and wonderful students has been, of course, the happiest accident of all. Thank you, and go Blue.
Thank you very much, Professor Karan. Congratulations on this wonder. We have time for 1 or 2 questions if you're available.
I got no place to go.
Wonderful. Your career has been typified, I think, by one in which you've engaged in the public sphere. There's a question around how you've selected your research topics. It seems like everything you've done has had a knack for ending, either had an impact, we would call it translation in some fields, public engagement in the other, at the national level or for the university. How is that also luck in terms of how you've chosen research, or is there something about how you choose topics that leads inevitably to this translation, which is so important to our mission as a university?
You know, it's what I like to do. So I said earlier that seeing one's work in a different, so one sees one's work in academic journals and at seminars and such, and we're all sort of trained and socialized to that. And that's extremely important and actually great fun to have those interchanges. But seeing one's work do something, be part of something outside of the immediate environments of the academy, and perhaps even make a difference in people's lives, that's just a kick. It's something I enjoy. So I think the luck there really stems from those dinner table conversations with my parents and my brother, where everything was fair game, and you wanted to understand how it worked. And then if you can understand how it works, you can push on it a little bit and maybe make it work a bit better. So there, I think it's a God knows where those tastes came from. It's certainly been my pleasure to have them, and I love it that you appreciate them.
So it's not a bug, it's a feature of how you do your work.
That's right.
I'll try to sneak in one more question if we can take another minute, which is very intrigued by the concept of library utopia. And so just wondering if you were thinking back to how you and your colleagues stood up the Google project, and now we're a number of years after it, we're kind of well into the future. How does that look? How is the current, where we're going, the same or different, or as you would have predicted based on that scanning project?
So I had hoped when we started that by now we would have solved the various rights and related problems, and we would really have something close to the universal library. And there was a period during the back and forth of the various lawsuits where there was a settlement proposal that might have actually made that happen. And for various reasons, it didn't. So on the one hand, I am disappointed that we didn't get as far as I hoped we would get, and I still hope we will get. On the other hand, everything has changed. The rich expectation that everyone has is indeed that there will be, by some mechanism or other, a way of getting at almost everything so that it can be used. A lot of that isn't quite as straightforward and, dare I say, legal as we might like, and the university is scrupulous about doing things legally. But it is, young people today actually can't imagine how difficult it was for us to be able to get at the academic literature in our fields. And in the humanities, where much of the work, much of the source material of the humanities is in the public domain, it's old. Again, my colleagues tell me over and over again, the world's libraries are at their feet or at their keyboard. And so not quite utopia. And indeed, I believe that the Academy should be painting pictures of utopia in everything that it does. We really do have a special character and a special set of obligations. Not quite utopia, but we're sure happy that we did it rather than that we didn't. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Painting utopia, that's a great way to wrap this. Congratulations again, Paul, Professor Courant. Let me now turn to Professor Schlissel to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. And of course, congratulations, Paul, and thank you. As a fellow West Wing fan, I really love hearing Sam Seaborn quoted by a scholar, so thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next awardee, Deborah E. Goldberg, the Margaret B. Davis Distinguished University Professor Emerita of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. One of the world's leading plant ecologists, Professor Goldberg is responsible for developing a new paradigm for interactions among species that better predicts the outcome of competition and has developed new insights into the far-reaching consequences of biodiversity. What's more, her leadership and service during her decades at the university were nothing short of outstanding. Among other examples, Dr. Goldberg served with distinction as the founding chair of U of M's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. She led several model efforts to increase the access and success of underrepresented students in STEM disciplines. Deborah is credited with the development of programs such as U of M's Frontier Master's Program in Ecology and Biology, which recruits and prepares students for top PhD programs. Her many accolades include the University of Michigan's Distinguished Diversity Leaders Team Award and the Sarah Goddard Power Award. She's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and is a fellow and past vice president of the Ecological Society of America. Her lecture today is titled Ecology of the Anthropocene. It is my honor to present Deborah Goldberg, whose distinguished university professorship is named after pioneering ecological scientist and former U of M faculty member, Margaret B. Davis. Congratulations, Professor Goldberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. I am delighted to be here. And I need to start with, I'm going to start with an accident. Paul described his career at Michigan as a series of accidents, and that made me want to tell my accident, which is the reason I'm a biologist is because I took biology in my first year in college to get my science requirement out of the way. So that was certainly an accident, and I'm just stunned to where that wonderful accident has led me. It is indeed a great honor to be here and to have this award. I have spent almost my entire career at the University of Michigan, and it has been an enormous privilege. My colleagues and students in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and also my colleagues around the entire university, has provided me with an enormous wealth of intellectual stimulation. I can only describe it as being in an intellectual candy store. Like Paul, I have truly appreciated the interdisciplinarity of being at this university. If I started naming individuals, I would be here for the next 20 minutes. So I'm just going to say thank you to all of my friends and colleagues and my students, postdocs. And you know who you are, and I hope you know how much I appreciate you. I am going to do one name, however, and that is my wonderful son, Benjamin, who has given me so much wonderful joy over the years and made everything else worthwhile. So thank you, Benjamin. I'm going to need to introduce Margaret Davis, after whom I've named my chair. Margaret has been a hero of mine since before I started graduate school, when I thought I might be interested in paleoecology. Margaret is one of the founders of modern approaches to paleoecology, which she studies fossil pollen to reconstruct she uses fossilized pollen to reconstruct the past history of ecological systems. And she was one of the first people to realize that to do that properly, you had to calibrate that with modern fossil pollen assemblages and modern plant communities. So Margaret has long been a hero of mine, but she became even more so when I moved to Michigan and discovered she had been, until the early 70s, a faculty member here. And what I understood is that Margaret realized that she was paid considerably less than comparable male faculty. In fact, as a new full professor, she was paid less than most male associate professors. And she threatened to sue the university over it. And she eventually, after many battles, received a more appropriate salary, but never quite, and still to this day, has not received an acknowledgement and an apology from the university. Perhaps as a consequence, Margaret was recruited away to Yale, then to the University of Minnesota as a department head, eventually being elected as a National Academy of Science member, and has still been an inspiration to me and many other women around the country. I would like to say there's a wonderful article about this in the Ann Arbor News that goes back to about 1970. And I would like to say that the university does a lot better now. We're still not perfect, but we no longer are quite this blatant. So what do I do as a community ecologist? I consider myself a plant community ecologist. That is, I like to think about the groups of plant species that live together and how and why they vary over space and time. So, for example, elevational gradients, wetlands, deserts, some of my favorite communities. And I am particularly interested in how and why plant communities vary over space and time. And how and why how species interactions influence these patterns over space and time. Plants all interact. They don't just accumulate and stack in a single environment. What makes communities interested is the very fact that they do interact, and that influences those patterns. In my earlier part of my career, I focused more on the mechanisms of interaction. and tried to develop some general rules about how plants interact exactly. But in more recent years, I've become much more interested in the consequences of those interactions. And that's because humans are having an enormous impact on the environment of the earth. And with that changing environment, ecologists are increasingly being asked to project what does that mean for the Earth's natural environments? What is it, natural communities? What does that mean for how they function? And how does that in turn feed back to humans? So that became a much more urgent question for many, not only for me, but for many ecologists. And probably the most important, or undoubtedly the most important aspect of global change in the Anthropocene is climate change. We know that, get my cursor over there. Well, I can't. CO2 has increased since, especially since the start of the Industrial Revolution, as we've begun burning fossil fuels way beyond how much it's fluctuated up and down over the ice ages. And as a consequence, temperature has gone up with that rise in CO2. And we are continually reaching new records of temperature. But temperature is not the only aspect of the Anthropocene. We are also having, I did have this there. Okay. Humans are also causing major alteration of global nutrient cycles through creation of artificial fertilizers, as well as burning fossil fuels again. We've vastly increased the amount of nitrogen circulating around the globe, and both in the atmosphere, on land, and in the oceans, and that has enormous consequences. And then the last piece that we often talk about, as part of global change in the Anthropocene, is humans are really good at moving species around. Now, we do that deliberately for crops and horticulture, but we also do it a lot not deliberately in ballast water or in shipping containers and in our shoes. And as a consequence, some of those species, not all, go out into nature and become invasive and have large consequences. The United States in this graph is number of invasive species per country. The red is the highest level shown here, and we're up there. So we have these multiple aspects of global change, what we often refer to as global change, and these are huge subjects. We have institutes of global change in the Anthropocene. We have courses, we have majors, we have people devoting entire careers. So the title of my talk was just a tiny bit of hubris, I would think. But what I'm going to do is focus on just a small piece of this, and that is I'm going to illustrate how species interactions are really important, in fact, are critical for predicting how communities respond to these global change factors. And then I'm going to use the results of these examples to talk more generally about prediction in ecology. Ecology is enormously complex. We have lots of environmental factors. We have lots of species in any one location. We have lots and lots of pathways by which all that interacts. And as a consequence, prediction is hard. And so what are the ways in which we can try to make that simpler? Okay. My first example is on wetland invasions and anthropogenic nitrogen. So I'm combining two of those big global change factors. And I'm specifically my lab has been working on invasions into the coastal wetlands around the Great Lakes. And along with the invaders, we have a picture of a native coastal marsh, beautiful, expansive. There are two really common invaders into those that we've worked on. One is hybrid cattails, the other are the giant common reed. And both of these can be really large as individuals. They form really dense stands. And as a consequence, they often are almost inevitably reduce native diversity, both of plants, but also a lot of alteration of wildlife habitat. They alter property values, they alter recreational opportunities, and they alter ecosystem function, which is another whole piece of some of the things I've done that I won't be talking about. As part of my work on these wetland invasions, I've been involved in really fun collaborations with hydrologists, group at MSU, with an ecosystem modeler, Bill Curry, who is in SEAS here at Michigan, a group of remote sensing specialists at Michigan Tech. So this is a really fun Michigan collaboration. And we've been trying to put together models and data that link climate and land use and upland watersheds through to nutrient inputs to those coastal wetlands, which then in turn, through our ecosystem community models, can predict where are we going to find invasions and what are the consequences for ecosystem functions, including things like carbon sequestration, carbon storage, which is becoming a really important component of thinking about global change. I'm going to talk specifically just about the competition between invasives and natives, in this case, the cattail. And conventional wisdom and a fair amount of data shows that the invaders are often associated with high nitrogen. And the idea then is that we might expect that they require high nitrogen. And in fact, if we look at the density of cattails as a function of available nitrogen, we see an increase, but it's a very noisy increase. We see even at low nitrogen, you can still see even at low nitrogen, you can still see very high invaders. So a lot of variability in this relationship. Again, prediction in ecology is hard. So we were interested in whether competitive interactions with the natives might have something to do with that. And to that end, and also to look at some other of the more ecosystem function aspects, we set up what we call our cattle tank experiment. We have a big array of cattle tanks, which are experimental wetlands. Both this one is picture is at the George Reserve out in Pinckney, property belonging to the university, but also at the University of Michigan Biological Station in northern Michigan. And in each of those cattle tanks, we supply different amounts of nutrients. So we have an experimental nitrogen gradient, and then we planted natives in half of them and cattails in all of them, so that we could look at the interaction between the two. And what we find, if we look at that middle graph, is that when cattails are growing alone, they can survive even at low nitrogen. Of course, they grow a lot better when we give them more nitrogen, but they can persist even at low. But when we grow them with natives, they are completely eliminated at the lowest nitrogen levels, and they are strongly suppressed at even the high nitrogen. That is, we have a phenomenon that's been called biotic resistance, where the best way to manage natives can be, the best way to manage invasives, can be by the native vegetation themselves. So why do we have invasives in so many areas? Well, because we have some disruption of those native communities, and at least in this case, success of those invaders requires some disruption of the native community, which suggests that the variation we see, when do we see invaders, when do we not, may be due to variation in the biotic resistance in the native community, as well as, or even instead of, the abiotic environment. Again, interactions are critical to understanding these impacts. My second example of looking at interactions is going to be focused on climate change, that defining issue of our era. And again, I take an experimental approach. I like doing experiments. I like being able to manipulate things and see that direct causal consequence. And one of the major ways, or most logical ways to think about how our plant community is going to respond to climate change is, well, manipulate the climate and see what happens. Give us a projection of what the future holds. And one of the most common ways to do that in plants are these open top chambers that you see an example of here, which concentrate the heat and so raise both the soil and the plant temperature. And there are networks of these all around the globe, although especially in the Arctic and alpine areas, which are experiencing some of the greatest warming. So knowing what's going to happen is particularly important. And we've learned a lot from them, but they have a couple of limitations. And the most important one of which is that you don't have immigration, those sides actually inhibit immigration into them. And so you get change in those communities due to changes in abundance of species that are already there, or you can get local extinction of species that were there, but you don't get new species. So it's eliminating one of the most common important ways in which communities are going to be able to track climate, which is to get new species better suited to that new climate in there. So together with my friend and colleague Vigdis Vanvik at the University of Bergen in Norway, developed an approach where instead of changing the climate, we move the community. We manipulate the community by digging up this community, putting them in these boxes that you see to the right, and then finding a lot of students and moving those communities to a new climate. It works really well for these communities, low stature, fairly shallow soil. Obviously, you can't do it for trees, but we've been able to use this in a grid of sites in Norway where we can where we're looking at changes in environment, not only warming, going from alpine down to subalpine or subalpine to boreal, simply by going down in elevation. We can also manipulate, put communities into new rainfall regimes by moving them from inland in Norway, which is very dry, towards the coast, which is very wet. If you've ever been in Western Norway, it rains a lot. So what we do is take a community, move it either to warmer, those are those red lines, or move it to a wetter, those are those blue lines, or to both warmer and wetter habitats, the purple lines. And Norway is expected to get both wetter and warmer. And so we're looking to see how things change, but looking at it across an entire grid of sites. We've then been monitoring those for, almost 10 years now. And we've measured a lot of things in those turfs, but the thing I'm going to talk about right now are just the community composition. And here's an example of some of those results. This is a complicating looking graph, but the key point is that each point on this figure represents a single physical plot and describes the community of that plot. And points that are closer together on the graph are more similar to each other in what species are there and how abundant they are. You first look at the controls. Those are the gray dots in the lower left. Those are the communities where we just picked them up and then transplant them right back to where they were. And you can see they don't go anywhere. They're just circling around. On the other hand, if we take the warming plots, so we start with those triangles on the top and then the red lines going down. They start in a colder place. That's what they look like with those triangles. Then over time, those red lines are moving closer to the community that exists in their destination site. So they're converging to their new climate, to what the community looks like in the new climate. Same thing if you do the wetting, those blue lines moving to the left, or the warming and wetting. And so we actually see pretty fast convergence. We were very impressed. This happened and actually got this far after only about 4 years. But this is only a single site in that grid of 12 different sites. And when we look at all of them together, we actually see that the rates of that convergence are highly variable across sites. And the reason they're so variable is because the colonization of new species that are changing, making it more like the new site, or extinction of species that don't even occur in the old site, are highly variable with environment. They change with the temperature, they change with the precipitation. So just warming, giving exactly the same treatment, warming by the same amount, does not give you a very clean prediction of what the colonization and extinction rates are going to be. That is, the results are what we call context dependent. Or you could just say really noisy. And this context dependency is ubiquitous in ecology, plagues all of our attempts to make predictions because the things are variable out there. So the golden standard in science is to do an experiment and expect to get the same result when you do the same thing. And frankly, it doesn't usually happen in ecology. We need large sample sizes. So what happens if we incorporate interactions? Well, we get a lot more of the variance explained. That green, these graphs show how much of the variance in colonization and extinction rates are explained by interactions. And the black is climate change. That's what we thought would be the major factor. The gray are, well, where do you live? And those were really big. But when we add interactions, the bars on the right in each sense, especially for extinction, the interactions are actually what's really explaining things. Even the effect of climate change itself, that black part of the bar, is really small. So yes, it's necessary to include species interactions, but my real point is that incorporation of these interactions may actually eliminate some of the context dependency that plagues ecological prediction. And I'm going to just close with this idea that this gives us a new research agenda for moving forward in predicting communities. And that is, we can separate the effects of environment on some measure of interactions, what we're calling biotic integrators, as a separate agenda from how do those biotic integrators that are a result of those environments, but are themselves the key driver, the underlying mechanism of the interactions that change communities. And what we're working on now is trying to understand what those integrators are, how they vary, and how can we use them to improve our predictions across ecological systems. And with that, I hope I've left a little bit of time for questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Congratulations, Professor Goldberg, Deborah. Wonderful, wonderful, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'd like to, we have time for one question, and it kind of cuts across your two parts of your talk. We noticed that in the first part, you talked about invasive species and how the different human interactions couple together. In that case, it was nitrogen couples to how the invasive species interacts with the native species.
Mm-hmm.
But it seemed in the second part of your talk, then you were talking about introducing new species. It was a little bit of a different terminology.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about how, in the context of climate change, how one thinks about new species that might be beneficial versus invasive species that might not be, and if there's things that we should be taking away as we think about climate change.
Wow, that's a great question. We actually just published a paper on, some people think of, with climate change, we get immigration of new species into an area that might be better adapted to that. Should those be considered, they can be called climate migrants, same, but they could also be considered as invasives. But but that has a negative connotation. And we've tried, are there lessons we can learn from the study of invasive species with these climate migrants? It bears on a whole lot of issues about conservation. Are we trying to conserve communities there they are now, even though they're no longer suited to these new environments? Sometimes we might want to consider what happens. Part of the reason why people are so concerned about climate change in mountains is what happens to the tundra, the wonderful alpine meadows you see at the top of mountains as it gets warmer. They have nowhere to go. They can't just keep going up to escape that warming temperature. So how do we conserve those? So we have, on one hand, it seems like a good thing to track, communities should track climate. On the other hand, when they track climate, we're losing some species, especially those that have nowhere else to go. And so it's a complicated thing to think about, and I don't have a solution to it, but we definitely are trying to bridge those gaps and think about lessons from each one and how they relate to the conservation problem.
Very interesting. Definitely see how that relates to alpine climates, and also seems like very important scientific questions, but also questions for the public as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, and I'll turn it back again to Professor Schlisel to introduce our next honoree. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Michael. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Professor Goldberg, and congratulations, of course. We now move to our third and final awardee today, Judith T. Irvine, the Edward Sapir Distinguished University Professor Emerita of Linguistic Anthropology. An internationally renowned linguistic anthropologist, Dr. Irvine established path-breaking frameworks, demonstrating the importance of using language as a tool to better understand other social forms, including hierarchy, inequality, and ideology. In her wide-ranging work, she studied everything from American anthropology in the early 20th century to sociolinguistic ethnographic research amongst the Wolof people of Senegal and the Wolof speakers in the United States. Many of her works are now considered part of the canon of linguistic anthropology. Leaving a record of impressive service, some of her notable commitments include chairing the Department of Anthropology, serving on the LSA Executive Committee, and assisting the development of the U of M African Studies Center. She was elected to the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, amongst many other honors and accolades. Heralded as an extraordinary teacher, she established a reputation for empowering students and, to quote her nomination materials, creating a space in which no question goes unanswered. Today, she'll give a lecture entitled Linguistic Difference and Social Stereotyping. It is a great pleasure to present Judith T. Irvine, whose distinguished university professorship is named after renowned 20th century anthropologist Edward Sapir. Congratulations, Professor Irvine, and welcome.
Thank you so much, President Schlisel. And I'd like to thank you and Provost Collins and Dean Solomon for this award, which is such a tremendous honor. And thanks also to the many other people who would have been involved in proposing me for it, or in supporting me in my work, or contributing ideas in my classrooms, or letting me work with them in field work. So thanks to all. And I'm very grateful to have been able to come to the University of Michigan, where there can be respect and support for work in my field, including mine. So I named my chair for Edward Sapir, one of the great intellectual ancestors of anthropology, linguistics, and my subfield of linguistic anthropology. Sapir believed that the study of language and communicative behavior was central to anthropology, and I follow him in this broad sense of our discipline. He died before I was born, so I never met him. But I have several personal connections, including that I reconstructed and edited a book he was planning to publish, but he did not live to complete it. By the way, although Michigan was never his main academic appointment, he did teach here in the summer of 1937 in Angell Hall. Now, my research has concerned language use in social action, especially how we draw on various different ways of speaking to accomplish social goals. We all have multiple ways we can speak, whether it's being multilingual or using various kinds of English, say, or just the different styles of talk that we have for different audiences and different occasions. Today, I want to focus on how these various ways of speaking take part in social stereotyping, how such linguistic stereotypes are put together, and how they get used in everyday politics of language, and not just in everyday politics. But this is a big topic, and I only have 20 minutes, so I'll offer you some snapshots and hope they do the trick. Can I have the next slide, please? The first metaphorical snapshot is about me, age 17. You don't get to see an actual picture of me, but at age 17, when I went up from Maryland to college in Cambridge, Massachusetts, my new acquaintances there, who were almost all from New York or New England, apparently thought I sounded Southern and thought this was funny. What I took from that was sounding Southern might mean sounding stupid, sounding like somebody whose ideas could not be taken seriously. So I thought I needed to change my speech, and my self-analysis was that I needed to speed it up, especially the vowels. No more now. Well, the stereotype I was drawing on in this piece of bad reasoning was, can I have the next slide? The South is slow. Southern speech is slow, and slow talk means slow minds. Now, it's not clear that my speech, or speech more Southern sounding than mine then was, is actually slower than the speech of my New Yorker friends. There are more aspects of talk and interaction at work than how fast you make it through a vowel. The stereotype is a projection, an image in sound that is taken to reveal something internal about a person, even about the population of a whole region. It's as if some linguistic characteristic derives from some mental essence, the way their mind works. Linguistic stereotypes are images in sound taken to reveal something deeper about character. Notice also that there has to be a contrast. Talk is only slow in comparison to something faster. Contrasts, comparisons, and linguistic differences are crucial. Can I have the next slide? My second snapshot comes from my doctoral fieldwork many years ago in a small town in Senegal among people who speak Wolof, an African language. The slide is a map of West Africa. There's a red arrow on the slide pointing to Senegal and a red X marking sort of where my fieldwork was. I did go back a bunch of times, but anyway, next slide, please. Here I am during my first field work, talking to a local resident with my notebook in my hand. Now, early on in that work, I encountered an ethnographic puzzle. Next slide. Here's the first piece of it, outlined on the slide. I was walking with a local man, whom I'll call MK, toward the town center, where we saw a group of about 20 men sitting on benches in a circle, with others, both men and women, standing behind them. One of the seated men was wearing a uniform. Another, wearing the usual local kaftan, was standing next to him and shouting at the crowd, declaiming something at great length. Occasionally, the kaftan guy would bend down to where the uniform guy was, and the uniform guy would say something softly, right into his ear, Kaftan would straighten up again and resume shouting. "So what's going on?" I asked my friend MK. He pointed to the uniform guy and said, "It's the chef d'arrondissement," a visiting government official who didn't actually visit very often, but he was there then. "The shouter," MK said, "is a gueule," that's a Wolof word, a griot in French. That's why he's addressing the crowd. The official is telling him what to say. Griots, MK told me, know how to speak up. Speak up in a loud and high-pitched voice. I'm doing that, not MK. Other people, MK said, would be ashamed to do that and never would. Now, this involves some local social stereotypes. Next slide, please. The griots are a sort of bardic caste of praise singers, orators, musicians, and performers, specialists in the arts of communication. But their social rank was low in this very status-oriented traditional hierarchy that prevailed in rural Senegal. Higher-ranking people despised the griots in various ways and often tried to avoid them. Just to illustrate, next slide. Here is a griot man addressing a crowd loudly and vehemently with dramatic gestures. And next slide. Here is a griot woman also addressing a crowd on a different occasion. This is just, so you shouldn't think that griots are only men. By contrast, next slide. Here's a group of high caste men in conversation. You can see how tightly they're positioned and how they're holding themselves. But these behaviors are not the puzzle. The puzzle came a little later. Next slide. It came one evening when I saw the same friend MK who had explained the situation with uniform guy and the griot. I saw him inside the local chief's house addressing a group of men in sort of the same way as griots do, that is, in a loud, high-pitched voice. Now, why did he do this? I knew he was not a griot, and he had just told me that people in his high rank category would not speak like that. Yet here he was. Well, what to make of this? It certainly involves local stereotypes of social rank, of caste, and the behaviors that go with them. In the stereotype, someone's speech performance reflected their caste essence. It was supposedly a matter of mentality and occupation, even of the body, because people are born into a caste and they could only marry within it. Next slide. So this is an auditory image, the vocal part of a social stereotype, just as the slow Southern speech was in my first case. The Senegalese stereotypes contrasting high and low caste rank connect low rank with loud, high-pitched verbosity, and high rank with soft, low taciturnity. But linguistic stereotypes can be imported into other situations. When my friend MK, who was high caste, was speaking in this surprisingly griot-like manner, surprising to me, the people he was speaking to were all older men who ranked higher than he did. So he drew on a stereotype of low-ranking behavior to defer to the older men. These stereotyped behaviors show up in interaction, deferring to someone who receives deference. Stereotyped contrasts in speech styles are drawn upon when there's a social situation that is about their relationship. Here, some kind of hierarchy. Similarly, though, a stereotype can be drawn upon for individual projects. So in that Wolof community, if somebody wanted to ask for financial help, he or she would take on some piece of the lower style of speaking and ask for help in a sort of griot-like style of talk. In short, stereotypes are productive. They apply to new situations, not just the ones they start with. Next slide. My third snapshot is an example of multilingualism. I could find examples of that from all over the world. Here's one from Senegal, although it's from a different part of the country from where I worked. This comes from research by Friederike Lübke and her team. Let's consider a linguistic portrait of Georges, to use his French name. He actually has several names. Georges comes from an area in Senegal of great linguistic diversity. It's the southern part of the country. Next slide. The map on this slide has a green arrow pointing to that region. It's the little slice south of the country, the Gambia, which sticks into Senegal. And the next slide, can I have it please? Next slide, shows the region in more detail, although it identifies only some of the languages Georges speaks. Those are the languages grouped together under the label Jola. Georges' parents come from different villages, each associated with a different language. Much of the region is dotted with such villages whose inhabitants must marry outside their own little community. They marry into other villages. So women marrying into such a village will usually identify with some language other than their husbands. Their children are often sent out to be fostered by someone who may live in yet another language area. But everybody is multilingual. Next slide. So here is Georges' situation. In his father's village, he passes for a speaker of its language by nom Goubert, and he counts as a member of that community. But when he goes to his mother's village, where he lived for most of his childhood, he's recognized as a speaker of that village's language, Egima Jola. In the city of Ziguinchor, which is a regional center, Georges counts as a speaker of Jola, an umbrella term that includes considerable diversity and usually implies, unless you specify otherwise, it usually implies Jola Fonyi, which is something rather different from the Egima Jola spoken in Georges' mother's village. Georges can speak other forms of Jola too, but when he's in town, he usually speaks either Wolof, which works as a Senegalese lingua franca, or French, the language of officialdom. It's tempting to think that Georges' changing linguistic identifications and practices are unusual, but they're not. His case is not rare. Multilingualism is widespread around the world and systematic, but it's unseen in projects run by outsiders that try to pin people down as if they belonged to homogeneously monolingual communities. In fact, next slide, please. If we look at a language map of Senegal, granted, this is kind of a rough scale one, but on this language map, all this patterning gets erased. Language maps are usually like that. It's as if everyone in a given region speaks just one language homogeneously, no internal differences that matter, and no multilingualism or multidialectism or multi-anything. This too is a kind of stereotyping in which a single language, ethnicity, and cultural tradition and residential territory are supposed to go together in a sort of national or subnational bundle that contrasts with other such bundles. We can see that kind of stereotyping in many places. Nationalistic movements often draw on it, erasing multilingualism and variation. Next slide. My final snapshot returns to the US and the political valences of linguistic stereotypes. I'm thinking now about images of standard American English, especially school-based standards, and the kinds of people whose speech is supposed, by some folks anyway, to come closest to that norm. So what about people whose speech does not fit that norm? Some linguistic deviations are regional or ethnic or class-based. Some, as in my first snapshot of some kinds of Southern regional speech, may even be taken to imply that the speaker is slow-witted or uneducated or somehow incompetent. And that's an implication that all too often goes with racialized evaluations. But there's another kind of linguistic deviation, which is norm-breaking, transgressive. Next slide. Here's an example. The slide shows a photograph from a newspaper article about a protest in California in 2004 against the move to legalize gay marriage, which had just become legal in Massachusetts, that home of radical lefties, cosmopolitan elites, and vice. Well, the message in this woman's sign, "This ain't Massachusetts," is not just non-standard English. It's anti-standard. It's part of her political protest against what she perceives as an elite social project. Her anti-standard wording portrays her anti-elitist position. Well, let me conclude. Next slide, please. We all have repertoires of ways of speaking that we draw on for various purposes. I'm not talking to you now the way I speak to my cat, and a good thing too. The differences between these ways of speaking, as regards linguistic structures per se, may be wide or they may be narrow, and you can study that, but it's not my main agenda. My work instead looks at repertoires, projects, and the ideas, including stereotypes and ideologies that support these repertoires and differ according to a person's point of view. The stereotypes are built from contrasts in which images link something linguistic with something supposedly essential in the speaker, and these images systematically contrast. And stereotyping, as we know, tends to dismiss or disattend to behaviors that don't quite fit. These stereotypes are social, requiring uptake and interaction. They're not only about individual psychology. So the contrastive stereotypes and their ingredients get put to use, and they can, in social action, and they can be taken up, reiterated, put to work in new situations as new actions and interpretations suggest. I call this kind of social action that draws on stereotypes ideological work. And when I say that it involves a politics of language, I'm not thinking so much of the doctrines of large-scale political movements, which are often enshrined in texts and position papers, but especially the ideas that underwrite ordinary people's activities and projects in everyday life, as well as on special occasions, and are often assumed rather than articulated as such. So next slide. That's all, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Irvine, for that very interesting and all very wide-ranging talk. We have some questions that I'd like to share with you. The first concerns, you've talked about the politics of language and this idea of ideological work. A question has been posed to if you could talk to the extent that you feel that this linguistic stereotyping is also used to restrict economic opportunity in the United States. So it's extending those ideas into the economic realm.
Oh, of course it is. When people are interviewed for jobs, for example, they're speaking, and how they speak has a whole lot to do with what happens. There's a story, this relates to my first example about myself, or what was taken to be the way that I spoke. This is about somebody who came from the Deep South and was interviewing for a job in a French department. He was a specialist in French literature. And the interviewers opened the interview in French, and he responded, and everything went swimmingly. And then toward the end, they were going to get more personal about him, and they switched to English, whereupon his Southern speech came out. And they looked at him, I'm told, I wasn't there. They looked at him and they burst out laughing. And he did not get that job. Well, you know, who knows? Maybe they wanted a specialist in some other aspect of French literature, but that's just, he didn't think it was all about that. He thought that his speech had something to do with it. And in the legal realm, this is also an important matter. And there's been some recent work on, for example, the Trayvon Martin trial and how witnesses were assessed. Some of them African-American and so forth. And it is clear that the way they spoke was very relevant to judgments that were made about them.
Thank you. Another question is if you could discuss code switching in different contexts and environments, especially with attempts to match the very cultural communities like you spoke about in your talk.
Attempts to match, I'm not quite sure what that would mean, but there are many, but people move through different situations and vary their talk accordingly. Or if they don't, then that becomes an issue also. Or maybe they don't on purpose. But this is true whether we're talking about somebody who is wildly multilingual and goes from one very different locale to another, or somebody who is simply talking to a different set of people, or me talking to my cat. You know, I'm not going to talk to you the way I talk to my cat, and we should all be glad.
Thank you very much, Professor Irvine, for that lecture. I'd like to now move to close our event with a few thank yous. First, I'd like to thank our lecturers and honorees, and also the members of the selection committee, all the nominators, our event team, and you as well as audience and participation in today's series. So this was a set of wonderful lectures and a wonderful virtual event. Thank you very much for participating, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you.